week 5 of our course. We've passed our halfway mark, so that should be encouraging to all of you. I want to start this week's video with just a couple comments about this week's discussion board entries. I do read all of them. I don't always comment on every single person's every week, but I try and comment on each of yours a couple of times over the course. I noticed that you guys had some really thoughtful responses to last week's topic of motivation. I think you found Daniel Pink's information and videos very interesting and compelling. And I kind of wanted you to think about that idea of motivation when you consider your essential questions. I've had about half of you, I think, submit your questions. I've given you feedback on those. And just the idea of what's going to motivate students to learn and what's going to be interesting to them should provide some motivation, as well as give you impetus for those rich questions that are going to cause a lot of inquiry for your students. So some kind of real world application as long as inquiry. One of the things I noticed in this week's discussion board entries is that a lot of you were not capitalizing all of the words in a title within your response. You still would capitalize all of those words just like normal. The only place where you do not do that is in your actual reference list when you are giving the name of the title of your work, and those would be just capitalizing the first word of the title. So I hope that clarifies it for you. I had some issues. I emailed all of you earlier, or actually late in the week. I had some issues with being able to grade the collaborative assignments. I could read them on discussion board, but I couldn't grade them on Grade Center, so I've asked for those to be resubmitted under submit assignments, just like you would normally do. So one group, I think it's group 3, resubmitted theirs. That's been graded and is in there. So I'm looking forward to finishing those up this week and getting those corrected. But what I saw on under the discussion board where I could access them looked really good, very professional, very nice. So I'm looking forward to finishing that up for you in the next day or two. So for this week's discussion board, you are going to start with a brief explanation or description of the differences between educational aims, goals, and objectives. Then they're asking you to branch into how each is considered during curriculum planning, either for you personally or for your department as a whole, depending on what kind of approach your department or your school takes for curriculum planning. And then from there, they want you to articulate any thoughts in regards to how the backwards design model supports the task of considering those educational aims, goals, and objectives. So something that might be a little bit helpful, this is in an old text that we don't use any longer with Peter Heberwich, but he defined aims as your broad targets, not specific enough to direct instruction, just a general outline. Then your goals were kind of an intermediate level of specificity. And then lastly, your objectives are more precise and instructionally sensitive targets in your curriculum. So your objectives are what you teach to each day. Your goals are going to be your bigger ideas, maybe your standards. And I think sometimes we could even think about our essential questions as our broad aim. In Chapter 7 in your textbook, these are addressed on pages 204 to 215. And then there's a nice overview table on page 215. So be sure and take a look at that before you write your response to this week's discussion board. And there is only one discussion board question. In Chapter 7, as you're reading this week, there were a couple of statements that really struck me that I'd like you to think about and how they're going to relate to your unit design. On page 204, the author says, schools continually modify their curricula, but instructional practice seems to change little. If you were in a face-to-face class with me, this would be a big focus of discussion for us about changing your instructional practice. So that's why when we're looking at this unit of study and you're designing your essential questions, I encouraged you to not just plug in a unit that you've done in the past, but to really think about how can I change my instruction to really be motivating, interesting, leading students to deeper inquiry and to some real-world applications. I want you to think about how, what, and why you might want to change your instructional practice as you're designing your unit. Also on page 206, the author quotes Noddings, and he says, Noddings opines that today in education we really do not frequently query ourselves as to why we are doing what we're doing. Why are we striving for certain things? And that quote really resonates with me. If you have ever seen any of Simon Sinek's TED Talks or interviews, he talks about starting with the why and the golden circle. So he also talks about people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe. So it's that idea of starting with the why. Why am I teaching this? What are the big ideas? And that is directly related to this backwards design of Understanding by Design template model that we're using for our unit plan. So you are given a link this week to a backwards design article. This is written by the authors. So again, pay good attention to the examples they're giving. You really don't need to read much further than page 22 because it goes into some design principles that we are not going to be using. It looks at things like facets of understanding and identifying those facets. We're not going to be doing that in this design, so you don't really need to include those in your design. You can surely read them if you'd like to, but they're not going to be requirements in this unit. I want you to be sure to look at all the examples that they're giving because these are the author's actual examples that they've included in this article. There are some templates that talk about before UBD, the way that teachers typically design a unit of study that are normally based upon the activities that you do with your students. And then they give you an after UBD design that starts with the why and the essential questions. So analyze the differences and see what it is that they're talking about here that's making this process different. Also in your text, on pages 196 and 197, it specifically calls out this backwards design model, and it gives you access to a video. So I would make use of that video as well as the article. So those are going to really help you get a clearer idea of what this process looks like. Back to the essential questions submissions. I want you to make sure that you look in the comments section because I did make my comments there rather than directly on the documents. Just remember that these essential questions are arguable. They are not questions that are answered by yes or no, and they're not text-dependent questions that are found right in the textbook. Some of you seem to be having issues with giving me a list of unrelated questions. There might be one question for math, one question for language arts, one question for PE. These essential questions have to be bound together and related in some way. Now, that is not to say that you cannot use cross-curricular activities when you plan your stage 3 learning plan, but it means that the questions should be connected. Some of the questions that I gave you feedback on were questions that were good questions. They're just not strong enough or big enough to be essential questions. But there's still questions that you might ask in stage 2 under assessment, or they might be questions that you give as part of your learning plan in stage 3. So don't throw them out, but they just were not big enough or strong enough to be essential questions. The other thing I want to make sure you understand is once I have accepted and graded your essential questions, please do not change them. My grading on your unit plan will be based upon the questions that you've already submitted and I've given you feedback on. Excuse me. There's no work due on the plan this week. However, I am going to put up the template under this week's resources. It will also be in there. There's links to it in next week's resources. And I'm going to be talking about the other stages of this plan. But what I'd like you to look at on that template is it asks you for your standards. It also asks you for some, I've lost the word, enduring understandings. So those enduring understandings are directly related to your essential questions. We have not asked you to do that yet, but I want you to be thinking about that. I want you to be thinking about the pieces that you see in the template for stage 1. I would suggest that you begin to think about the performance task that you're going to use in stage 2. It is that task that will be thinking about how you differentiate for your learners, options for their learning, and some kind of a summative assessment is what you're going to be looking for. This should be some kind of a performance test that is not pencil paper or a Scantron type of test, but we'll talk about that more next week. The last thing I want to remind you about is assignment 5 has to do with your library orientation. I hope you guys took a screenshot the night that you did the orientation, and then you were asked to locate a credible article through the CUI library that connects to topics in this course, and then upload that article along with your screenshot, and then in the text box discuss 3 key points. So they can just be bullets, doesn't have to be long, but 3 key points, and reference that article in the correct APA format. So those are your tasks for this week. Nothing too daunting, but stay on top of it. And if you have any questions for me, remember I'm always here by text or email. So have a great week, and I'll talk to you all next week.